Okay, good evening. My name's Arnie Eby. I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland Resource Parent Association. Welcome to our first Tuesday of the new year, January 5, 2021. This evening, we are joined by Josh Kroll from NACAC, and our subject will be the federal adoption tax credit. If you would kindly put your name and jurisdiction in the chat, we will notify your local recruiter that you attended tonight's meeting. It will be up to them if they give you credit for it. We will keep a copy of the slides if they ask for it for record. And we will also be posting the slides to our website in the next couple days. So the information will be available and we will go from there. I do not know if we'll do the recording online. We are recording the meeting, but we record it in order to get the comments, the chat, and other information so that we have that in an archive. So once again, my name's Arnie. Welcome to the first Tuesday talk of the new year. And please, if while you're at it in the chat, if you would like to give us some topics that you would like us to discuss this year, we would love to hear from you as to what you would like to have information on and like to discuss, because we will be doing this on a monthly basis. So welcome, Josh. Welcome back. Welcome to a new year. And I know this is a subject that you like to talk about that is fun for you, as you say. I'm not sure that many people call talking about taxes fun, but we'll let it at that. Maybe that just says that you are a unique individual. So please have some fun. Tell us about the adoption tax credit, the federal adoption tax credit, and you are the host, so you can share as you need to. And we will hold questions till, well, whenever Josh has openings, that if we will give opportunity for some questions. So take it away, Josh.
All right. Thanks. Yes, I am unique. I was good at math, and it's really nice when this helps people. Unfortunately, the credit, because it's not refundable, which I'll cover later on, is not as helpful as it used to be for many families. But if it can help you, even if it's a couple $100, I want, if it's the full 14,300, even better. It's not as scary as this slide makes it look out to be. There is some work. The good news is most people either hire someone or use software, and it does most of the math for you. So you don't have to worry about this sort of thing. Just want to make really clear that I am not a tax preparer. I am not, I haven't really prepared other people's taxes. I don't claim to be an enrolled agent, a CPA, anything like that. My degree's ironically in geology with the focus on groundwater. But I have been helping folks with this adoption tax credit since 2004. So we're entering my 17th tax season, and helping folks with this. And there are some things that are in the instructions that are there as recommendations from me and my coworkers. So we have a pretty good grasp on this one really small, narrow part of the tax world. People start asking me about, depreciation on a home that they use for, work from home. I have no clue. Could tell you, talk to someone who knows broader tax issues. I just know this one small area pretty well. So today I'm going to cover some basic information about the federal adoption tax credit, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the tax years 2021 through 2012, as well as at the end, we're going to cover claiming kids as dependents, which is very useful for people if you haven't adopted yet, but you've been fostering children, to know if you can claim them as dependents. The answer is maybe. And we'll go over those rules at the end of this session. So to be eligible for the federal adoption tax credit, you got to adopt the child. And I know it sounds like really stupid for me to say this, but I actually had a parent once say, what if you're just fostering, doing long-term foster care? It's called an adoption tax credit. Adoption's a key part of it. It can't be your spouse's child. So if you get married to someone and then you adopt that child, those costs for doing that adoption are not eligible. If you adopted your spouse's or your future spouse's child and then you later on got married, that should actually be eligible by my reading of it. The child has to be under the age of 18 at the time of adoption. For folks who are great in adopting teenagers, if a child turns 18 during the year, you adopt them before they turn 18, but they still turn 18 in that year, it's probably going to create some processing issues, but that child's still eligible because they were under 18 at the time of adoption. And mostly it's because if you don't check a box, it doesn't approve it with e-filing. And at that point, it's probably easiest to paper file. There is an income test limit with this. And we're going to cover that on the next slide. It goes up every year with cost of living, just as the adoption tax credit does. The last part is the child either has to be determined by the state to be considered special needs or have qualified adoption expenses. Children who have special needs or are considered special needs qualify for the maximum tax credit, regardless of what is paid out of pocket. So this is a scary bunch of numbers. So the first column is the year for adoptions from foster care. This is going to be the year that you finalize the adoption. The only people that it's not the year that you finalize the adoption is if you did a private domestic adoption. I'll gloss through that pretty quickly in a couple slides. So if I adopted a child in 2020, one child, I'm going to claim $14,300 as long as my income is below my modified adjusted gross income, which for most people is just your adjusted gross income, if it's below $214,520. If it's between $214,520 and $254,520, I'm going to get a partial of the amount that I'm claiming. If it's over this amount, I get nothing. And that income test is only applied in the year that you're claiming the credit. The other thing I want to point out here is this credit is per child. So if I adopted 2 kids, a sibling group of 2, and I get adoption subsidy for them, and sadly, I work in nonprofit world, my income is way below $214,520. So I would claim $28,600 in adoption credit, $14,300 for both children. So that is that. And the way the credit works is you claim it in the 1 year, and then it's kind of like Thanksgiving leftovers. Anything you don't use up in that year carries forward to the next year. And you keep doing that until you either use up all the credit or a total of 6 years have passed. After that time, any unused credit is like bad leftovers. It just disappears. You don't have access to that credit anymore. So, and we'll go into how the credit works a little later on. So the income test, as I said on the previous slide, only applies in the year that you're claiming the credit, which for most families is going to be the year that they finalize the adoption. And the reason I bring this up is there are times families do things that spike their income. Like a really sad case, there's a Kansas family adopted a sibling group of 4. They sold the family farm that year. Their income was over. They lost out on over $40,000 in adoption tax credit. Had they known about the tax credit, which they didn't, they would have made sure they didn't happen in the same year. I preferably adopt in year 1 and year 2, have the capital gains for selling the property and all that and all the taxes related to that. And then having 40-some thousand in adoption credit to help wipe out that tax cost, but they didn't know. So the income test is only applied in the year you are claiming the credit. If I'm carrying it forward, like I could, let's say I left this job and I had, some $500,000 job next year, that wouldn't impact the carry forward. That does the income test does not get applied to the leftovers from year one, or two or three or four. It's only in year one when you're claiming, establishing the credit that the income test matters. The other thing that matters in the year that you're claiming the credit is you can't marry filing separately. You can be separate, and if you are separated, you have to meet these three criteria. They're in the instructions. You lived apart from your spouse during the last 6 months of the year. The eligible child lived in your home for more than half the year. You provide over half the cost of keeping up your home. And I believe someone asked me, why do they have this? And I lazily said, because it's the law. I mean, I've looked and it is in the law. But it seems like it's in there to try and prevent families from trying to duck under that income test if they were higher income earners by filing separately and having it assigned to, if they make the same amount, it will, more often than not make them eligible, or one spouse might make a lot less. If you did adopt and you were separated, then you would file head of household, not married filing separately, in the year you claim the credit. The most common thing that I've heard in the last few years related to this is that some families who are getting they're public service or a teacher or something, and they're going to get some of their student loans waived or forgiven because they're in public service. They filed married filing separately. They don't necessarily have to. There are other ways they can establish the annual income for the loan servicer. But that is something I've noticed has been brought up a couple of times with families I talk to. And that's how I learn most of my stuff. It's like, I don't necessarily know what the problems are or the concerns are until someone calls, and then it's like, oh, well, we need to figure this out. So income tax and filing status only apply in the year you're claiming the credit. Now, if you adopt a child in 2020 and you adopt the child in 2021, because families do that, these will apply in both years because you've adopted children in both years and you're establishing the credit in both years. So when to file for the adoption credit? For international adoptions, in the year the adoption is final. For special needs adoptions where you're not documenting expenses, in the year the adoption is final. For private domestic adoptions, either the year the adoption is final, or if not final, the year after the expenses were paid. So if I was doing a private domestic adoption and I started the process, even if I haven't been matched with a family yet, I started the process in 2019. Let's say I paid a home study fee of $3,000 in 2019, I could still claim that $3,000 on my 2020 taxes because it's the year after I paid it and it's a domestic adoption. International, it doesn't work that way, but for domestic ones, it does. That $3,000 will limit how much credit I can get in a later year. It'll still be the same overall amount, but if I've already taken $3,000 in credit on my 2020 taxes, that will reduce by $3,000 how much credit I can take on my 2021 taxes. So not finalized adoptions, I just pretty much said all of this. The one thing I will say, if you don't have a child identified, even if you do have a child identified, if you don't have a social security number for that child, you'll have to paper file. It doesn't say that anywhere, but you will, because you can't e-file without a social security number or an ATIN on that line on the form to identify the child. And in that case, a family would just write down, see attached, and put information about their agency or attorney that's helping them do the adoption. But otherwise, I covered all of that. We'll skip that one. So,
hey, Josh,
go ahead.
Hold up 1 second.
Sure.
I made you the host, so can you just hit the record button to give me the comments and stuff, please? I can't set it up since I switched the host to you. Sorry about that.
It says recording. I have pause recording, stop recording.
Okay.
I don't have start recording.
Okay, maybe it's on.
How do I make you the host
No, just
again?
let it go. Just let it go.
Okay. All right. Yeah, it looks like yeah, I, I'm hoping we're recording. If not, you know how to get a hold of both of us for questions. I'm going to skip this. If anybody is doing a private adoption, which probably isn't pretty much anybody here, but if anybody is, they can always reach out to me directly. Um, but this is, I was talking with a person yesterday who's looking at adopting and is worried about a birth parent maybe changing their mind. And if you try to adopt a child, it doesn't work out, it's unsuccessful. And then later on, successfully, you're still limited to the total amount for attempting to adopt one child, even though there's two actual different children involved. And the IRS is very clear on that in the instructions. So, um, so children with special needs, this is probably going to apply to everybody here. Um, how do you know if your child is considered a child with special needs for the adoption tax credit? The answer really easily is, do you get adoption subsidy? If you don't get adoption subsidy, the child is not considered special needs. Now, if the state gives you a $0 subsidy agreement and gives you Medicaid, that is adoption subsidy. If they reimburse you for non-recurring adoption expenses and they give you Medicaid, but they don't give you a monthly payment, that is adoption subsidy for the purpose of the IRS. As long as you have an adoption assistance agreement that provides either monthly payment, Medicaid, or non-recurring, or any combination of those three, that is considered special needs for the IRS. And if you were ever to be questioned on that, I can't represent you in tax court, but we could definitely raise a stink with some people at the IRS to try and help you. But it's the lawyer who writes the instructions has confirmed to me, as much as I tried to get it in writing, with no luck. I gave up after 5 years of being that annoying kid. When are we going to Disney World? When are we going to Disney World? When are we going to Disney World? I'm never going to get it in writing, but I can rope her into conversations if it were ever, or just give you her number if it were ever asked or questioned if a $0 agreement is considered adoption subsidy. And I'm going to show you on the next slide why the adoption subsidy is key. When the adoption tax credit was refundable and people were it was just a nutty time for everybody. I would get these calls where people are like, "My child, I'll fax you," because it was 10 years ago. Now everybody's just scanning things and emailing them. But I'll fax you. I've got 17 pages of doctor's diagnosis. It's like that's not what the IRS is looking for. It's literally, is it adoption subsidy or not? And in um, federal law, the definition of special needs for adoption subsidy, adoption assistance, is almost word for word the same as for adoption tax credit. I'm sure when they put that provision in back in the 90s, they just lifted the language from the adoption assistance language. And I know there's been a court case where a family adopted a child privately that met the state's definition of special needs, but the state didn't determine the child with special needs and didn't give them an adoption subsidy. And they were limited just to their out-of-pocket expenses. They were not able to qualify as special needs. And I know they took it to tax court and they lost. And that's when the very legally written example on the next couple of slides showed up. So why does it matter if it's special needs, as I just was mentioning there? And it's sort of like the dead horse that I'll probably beat all night, is you get to qualify for the full amount, even if you didn't pay a penny for the adoption. You get to qualify for $14,300, even if you paid zero for the adoption process, which is not how it works for international or private domestic. There, it's tied to what they paid. And for that family in Florida, they paid less than the full amount, and that's why they're trying to get more, but they didn't qualify as special needs because it wasn't determined by the state. So This is the IRS instructions, line 1, column D, example 1. This is the part on the form where it says, is this child special needs? Check yes. Check if yes. So, and this is just, it's a pain, but we're gonna read through it. So Agency A is the Child Welfare Department of State V. Mark, Rachel, and Janet, brothers and sisters, are U.S. children residing in State V. When Mark was 10, Rachel 8, and Janet 6, Agency A removed the children from the home of biological parents. After Agency A placed the children in foster care, Agency A determined it would be difficult to place the children for adoption without providing assistance to the adoptive family because of the ages and sibling relationship of the children. And I really like that part because this example here does not talk anything about disabilities. These are kids who are hard to place, and you'll see on the next slide where, where it makes it clear the adoption assistance is key. Agency A provided the adoptive parents with monthly subsidy payments on behalf of each child. The adoption assistance agreements entered into between Agency A and the adoptive parents are evidence that State V has determined that Mark, Rachel, and Janet are children with special needs and may be used to support the adoptive parents' claim to the adoption tax credit. Mark, Rachel, and Janet are U.S. children who State V has removed from their biological parents. State V has also determined that each child has special needs. Their adoptive parents may claim an adoption credit for each child, even if the adoptive parents paid no qualifying adoption expenses if all other requirements of the credit are met. So that's pretty clear. The adoption assistance agreement is the key. And then further down, they qualify for the full amount, even if they paid no qualifying expenses. Those are the two key things that folks need to know. And this is line 1, column D, example 1, and then the other part will be line 5, special needs adoption, and that'll be the next slide. So I don't know, and there's probably not a good way. Usually I'm in a room and I can just get people to raise their hands. We don't need to do that, but a lot of people hire tax preparers. You don't need to hire someone for this. Like, people think, oh, I've always done my own taxes, but this is really complicated. It's not. You don't need to hire someone to do this. If you hire someone, don't expect them to necessarily know this. You need to educate them. You need to be pushy, because there's like, I don't know, maybe 80,000 tax returns a year that maybe have this in it. It's just not that many. I think there's like, I don't know, 80 million or 100 million tax returns that are filed a year. This is, it's not a lot to have it. And like a few years ago, I was working with a family in Colorado. They're like, well, maybe we need to hire someone special for the adoption tax credit. It's like, give them if you're using someone already, give them a chance. And if they really don't get it or say, you're wrong, especially if you don't have a personal connection to them, shop around, or learn how to do taxes yourself. Most families have pretty boring taxes. I'm one of them. I have a different credit that I have to go and do some work on, but software does it for you pretty easily. And that's, some of those people are just punching in numbers yourself. You can keep going to whoever you want, but don't expect them to necessarily know this. So what you need to know is, if you get adoption subsidy, child special needs, and when they ask for expenses, and for the folks who are doing your own taxes, when it asks for expenses on the screen, you want to put in the full amount if the child gets adoption subsidy and you've checked special needs. But if you're talking face to face with someone and they say, well, what did you pay in expenses? It's like, because they're considered special needs, I get to claim the full amount of $14,300 for adoption in 2020. So this is where it says in the instructions, this is line 5, special needs adoption. This is the first thing I got into the instructions. It actually had been in an earlier publication, and then they got rid of that and rolled a lot of things over. But I'm like, this is making my life difficult. I'll be honest, I was very self-motivated by this. I'm like, sort of lazy and efficient are sort of the same thing. And so I was like, IRS, is before I knew anybody there. I'm like, you used to have this thing that was more explicit. Tax preparers need more explicit information. Can you put this back in? Next year it showed up. It's like, that's cool. They actually read my email and in print the next year. It's like, wow, that's I can't believe someone actually listened. Giant IRS bureaucracy. So special needs adoption. If you adopted a U.S. child with special needs and the adoption became final in 2020, enter on line 5, 14,300 minus any qualified adoption expenses you use to figure any adoption credit you claim for the same child in a prior year. That's that private domestic adoptions that aren't complete yet. That's where that would come into play. Like that $3,000 I said I paid in 2019 that I claimed on my 2020, but I didn't finalize till 2021. This would come into play there. This is the amount you entered on line 3 of form 8839 for this child. Honestly, I'm not sure why they're really doing it, because it would self-correct with what you do on line 3, but they're the big bureaucracy and they do what they need to do. So the last part is the key. If you didn't claim any adoption credit for the child in a prior year, enter 14,300 on line 5, even if your qualified adoption expenses for the child were less than 14,300, and even if you did not have any qualified adoption expenses for this child. A lot of taxpayers say you can't get a credit without expenses. And it's like, there's a child tax credit where you don't document expenses. I mean, we all know kids cost more than $1,000 or $2,000 a year, but you're not documenting expenses for the child tax credit. You just need to let them know, well, it's the law. You can give them that, my answer, the flip answer, it's the law. Read the instructions. If your tax preparer doesn't understand this and doesn't agree with you, then it might be time to look for a new tax preparer if you're hiring one. So I'm going to do 2 more slides and then I'll open for questions. And then we'll get into how the tax credit actually works. So I don't know if anybody on here is, been doing this as long as I have, but 10 years ago when the adoption tax credit was refundable for 2010 and 11, it was a hot mess. So in those years, the IRS was asking for all this proof of stuff. They were worried about fraud. They didn't know what they were looking for at first in 2010. By 2011, they did, thankfully. And in those years, families had to paper file. And unfortunately, the IRS didn't fix that until 2013. In 2012, they weren't requiring people to submit documentation, but they still made people paper file, which was like, all right, guys, get a little back, once again, big bureaucracy. But people can e-file. And as I said earlier, if you're doing a domestic private adoption and you don't have a taxpayer ID or social security number for the child, or child isn't known yet, you will still have to paper file, but everybody else can e-file. And the reason I bring this up is I still hear from people 8 years later, 7 years later, like, oh no, I have to paper file. No, you don't. So I just want to, because there's old information out there that is not accurate at this point in time. Also, the other biggest one with, thinking about refundable is you don't get a big check from the IRS. I mean, some people do, higher income people will, but a lot of families are told that and they will not get a big check. And we're going to explain how the tax credit works on the next couple of slides after the break for questions. So families do not need to send in supporting documentation like they had to in 2010 and 11, but they should keep these documents handy in case the IRS ever audits them. Now, I'm going to be really clear here. Audit's a big, scary word. I have one more slide, Arnie. Audit them with the adoption tax credit. They were always what they called correspondence audits. They were just writing letters asking for documentation to prove something. They weren't going through a tooth comb of people's taxes and questioning everything. They're just like, we want you to prove that this adoption happened and that it, and these expenses or special needs existed. That's all the audit was. And the IRS is really bad at keeping track of them or getting them to the right person. So if you ever are asked this, send copies. Do not send originals, because the IRS is not good at keeping things tracked together. And if anybody on here works for the IRS, you're close to DC, sorry, it's the truth. I wish it weren't that way, but that's the reality of what happened in 2010 and 11 with this credit. So, and they weren't processed in DC, so it wasn't your department. So documenting the adoption, And a lot of people didn't keep these papers in those years. These are really important documents for people to keep. You should have these. These should be safe. If you have them at home, get like one of those little fire safety boxes. These are really important documents. So the first one, for all domestic adoptions, a court decree, something that says the judge or the court says you adopted this child. Okay. That's a really important documentation for a lot of reasons. Don't send the original if you ever are requested of this, but that's a really important document you should keep anyways. For international adoptions, it would be a foreign adoption decree translated into English, or a Hague adoption certificate, and some visas. And there's sadly not many international adoptions anymore. My sister was adopted internationally 45 years ago from Korea. So sort of makes me sad that other families aren't having that type of adoption. But for special needs adoption, the proof of special needs is your adoption assistance agreement. That's it. You don't need any doctor's things. You don't need anything else. It's the adoption assistance agreement is what the IRS should be looking for. And that's an important document. If like a family I talked to last week from Maryland who adopted years ago, and her husband passed away. They had the fight. If anybody was on this webinar, last month, they had the fight when he retired, or they retired, about Social Security and them trying to drop their adoption subsidy. Well, the county again is asking, now that they have survivor's benefits and it's Title 4E, that they're trying to reduce their adoption subsidy because of the survivor benefits, which they can't do. It's an important document. It's a contract that you have with the state. So keep a copy of that. For private, domestic, or international adoptions, you want to keep copies of receipts. You don't, for those families who are doing this, you just need to get over the $14,300 or whatever that amount. Don't sweat the small stuff. If you've got $20,000 in agency fees, you don't have to worry about that receipt from that one place that you had dinner at while you were going to, meet the child. You don't need to sweat the small things, especially, if it's starting to fade. Families are sweating that. It's like, as soon as you get over the amount you need, don't sweat the small stuff. So, Arnie, I'm ready for any questions you might have.
I'm not seeing anything in the chat.
Okay. Well, and at the very end, because we'll probably end a little early, I'm fine with opening it up to verbal questions too, if people want. So, but I'll get going with how the tax credit works, because this is kind of fun. For me, it is, but I know I'm a little different. It's good. You have a resource that enjoys this. So, and isn't charging you to help answer these questions. So we're largely funded by the Dave Thomas Foundation. So if you go to Wendy's and drop those coins in, some of that helps pay for the work that I do. So there's a couple words that I want to be real specific on in explaining how the tax credit works, because a lot of people, you probably can tell I'm a little informal and I can be a little loosey-goosey. I'm talking about carry forward, comparing it to Thanksgiving leftovers. That's not what you'd hear from an IRS professional. But I think it sticks with people a little better. But in explaining how the credit works, I want to be a little more specific, a little more out of my comfort zone by being really focusing on the words. So when I say claim, I mean, basically I'm shouting out to the IRS that I get this credit. I adopted a child's considered special needs. I'm eligible for $14,300 in adoption tax credit. So I'm claiming, I'm like town crier. Hey, IRS, I get this credit. See, I'm not completely formal, but once you claim the credit, you have to be able to use it. And the ability to use the credit will be limited by your tax liability for the year. So the most confusing thing for people is, what the heck is tax liability? That sounds very fancy. It's kind of scary. Tax liability is the amount you're responsible for in federal income tax for the year. And for anybody on here who's ever done their taxes themselves by hand, For most people, that amount is that number you took back from the tax tables. You said, okay, this is my just gross income, or no, this is my taxable income, after deductions, deductions and in the old days, exemptions. This is where I am. And then I go to the tax tables. This is my filing status. And then I come back with the number. That's what tax liability is for most people. It can also include premium repayment credits for the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. There can be alternative minimum tax. Most people I talk to, it's that number from the tax table. Most people have actually pretty boring taxes. So not everybody, that's why tax is really complicated and scary for people, but most people really have boring taxes. So this is my base example, and we're going to put the new twist from tax reform that was passed in 2017, effective in 2018 on the next slide. But this is to get you thinking about how the tax credit works. So NACAC withheld $4,000 from my paychecks to pay my federal income tax. We'll say this was in 2019. In 2019, I got my W-2. It says $4,000 in federal income tax withholding. When I went and did my taxes last year, the tax table said I owe $3,000 in income tax. And I have no credits, and I have no other taxes. Self-employment tax, anybody who has self-employment tax, that gets added back in afterwards. This credit does not help offset what you owe in self-employment tax, which is very unfortunate. And for those, anybody that's clergy or pastors out there, if you get a housing allowance, this is not helping with that, the self-employment tax you pay on the housing allowance. I've had not quite a few, probably 5 or 10 in my 17 years who were very unhappy to learn that this credit doesn't help with that tax. So I'm just asking you to think about it. What would happen? And then I'll tell you in a second, but what would happen if this is my situation? I had $4,000 withheld from my paychecks. Tax table say I owe $3,000. I have no other credits. I have no other taxes. What's my result? Do I have to pay in, or do I get a refund, and how much is it? And I'm sure you're all very smart people, and you know that you get a refund of $1,000 because that's how much you overpaid. So I had $4,000 withheld, but I only got $3,000, so I get $1,000 back because I overpaid $1,000. Okay. Now, the reason I've always done this example is sometimes people like myself, I regularly get a refund. I don't want someone who gets a refund to think, oh, I always get a refund, so I don't owe anything in income tax, so this credit won't help me. I'm not going to bother with this. I'm going to hang up right now. This isn't ever going to help me. Even though I got a refund of $1,000, I still owed the IRS $3,000 in income tax. Okay, so I owe them $3,000, and this adoption tax credit is going to help with that. So that's how it worked. Real basic for most families. It sort of worked out this. Well, I didn't do the actual end part because we're going to throw in the new twist because the child tax credit becomes a complicating factor. So when tax reform was passed and it started in 2018, the biggest change was the child tax credit. Now, before 2018, so 2017 and earlier, all 1,000 of the child tax credit, because that's how much it was for a long time. I don't remember back, maybe 04, 05, it might have been a little lower, but I think it's the whole 17 years I've been helping people, I think it's been $1,000. So children who are under 17 at the end of the year could get $1,000 child tax credit. And for families who had enough earned income, like if you're retired and most of your money is like pensions and not wages, you might not have enough earned income. But for most families, that $1,000 in child tax credit could 100% convert to what's called the additional child tax credit, which is a refundable credit. And that's great because it counts as a payment. It increases how much you get. But when they passed the tax reform, they increased the size of the child tax credit to $2,000, but only $1,400 of it can be converted to the refundable additional child tax credit. So there's always going to be $6,000 per child that would be used before the adoption tax credit. And if you have children over 17, they have 500 that can never be converted to the refundable additional child tax credit. So from my previous page example, I still owe 3,000, or I owed 3,000, which would be reduced to so let's say 2020 came along and the 4,000 and 3,000 stayed the same, like on this slide. So I owe 3,000. That's that tax liability. I owe 3,000 and I adopt one kid. I'm going to have 600 in child tax credit because the kid's under 16 and they get adoption subsidy. I'm going to have 600 that's going to wipe out 600 of that 3,000. And then I'm going to have another 2,400 that wipes out the remaining amount coming from the adoption tax credit. And I have 14,300 in the adoption tax credit. So I now owe zero because my income tax minus 3,000 in credits, I owe zero in income tax. And I don't have any other taxes. My payment, I still have the 4,000 that I had withheld on my W-2, but I now have 1,400 in additional child tax credit. So I now have 5,400 in payments. So my refund would be 5,400 because I have 5,400 in payments and I owe zero after my credits. So my refund went from $1,000 on the previous page, 1,000 back to I get 5,400 back. And I have 11,900 in adoption tax credit to carry forward to my 2021 taxes that I'll file a year from now. So that's how the adoption tax credit works. Now, here's the really great news. Your tax repair software, they do all of this. There's this really annoying thing called publication, child tax credit worksheet in publication 972 that has a line 14 worksheet and has a earned income worksheet. The first time I saw it in 06, I want to pull my hair out. Software, tax repairs, using software do it. If you ever wanted, if you're anybody does this by hand, call me. I will help walk you through it. It'll take half an hour, but I'll help you walk you through it because it is not fun. And I'll show you how awful that is at the end. I'll show you some forms. So earlier I talked about refundability and I've talked about how this adoption tax credit doesn't help anyone. And I forgot to update this slide. Because guess what? We're in a new Congress, so there are no bills right now. So boom, I would just fix that slide. We've been trying to get it to be refundable again at this point since 2011 when it expired. There was an end date to it and no one extended it. So we continue next Tuesday. We're going to have our first call of the year. I don't know that much is going to go on other than strategizing, see if we can try and wrap it into a stimulus package or something like that. Anything that's ever happened with the adoption tax credit has been part of a bigger bill. It's never anything passed on its own. But when the adoption tax credit was refundable, remember on this last slide here, I said I'm using 2,400 of the adoption tax credit. Well, let's see. Let's multiply this by 6. 6 times 2 is 12,000. 6 times 4 is 2,400. That's 14,400. I would just at this rate, I would be $100 spare room. If next year, if I adopted in 2021 and it was 2,400, I would lose out on $30 because next year it's $40 because it's 1,440. When it's not refundable, how much I can use is limited by your tax liability. And some families, their number is much lower than the 2,400. Some it's zero. They can't use any of the adoption tax credit. So we want to make it refundable. Oops, wrong slide. We want to make it refundable so it helps all families. When we looked at tax stats before tax reform, families whose adjusted gross income was below 30,000 really weren't going to be able to use the adoption tax credit unless it was refundable. The other thing is if you look at that last slide, so in 4 years, in 6 years, I'm going to use up a full amount at this rate, 2,400 a year times 6, like I said, that math. But if I adopted a sibling group of 2, I'm going to leave 14,000 $200 on the table, because I'm only going to use up $14,400 in 6 years. So making it refundable is something that we've been trying to do. There's an adoption tax credit .org website. There's a Facebook group. We are part of the very boringly named Adoption Tax Credit Working Group. So we're part of a group. Most of them are in DC, but we're a Midwest-based organization. But we're trying to make it refundable again, because it does help more families that way. Because right now it doesn't help as many families as we'd like. We want them to help every family. So you can go to the website, the Facebook page, or the web page. You can also go to NACAC, our web page, nacac.org, and sign up for our e-newsletter. It's not a bad one. It's like every other week we put out information. So, so for families who adopted in 2020, it's not refundable. Special needs adoptions do not have to qualify, do not have to have qualified adoption expenses. You can e-file, and families should keep records, as mentioned earlier. For anything before 2020, if you adopted in 2019 and you're like, oh, no one told me about this, let's look into this now, you're going to have to go back to the year you adopted that child. If it's from, you're going to have to go back to the year you adopted that child. If you hired someone to do your taxes, see if they'll amend them for free. They probably won't, but you can ask. If you use tax return software, see if you can amend it using the software. It already has your information in there. I use free software. I'm pretty sure that if I needed to amend, it would charge me to amend, but it'd probably still be the cheapest way. Although for me, at this point, I can do it by hand. So I would. Amended returns all have to be paper filed. No matter what, they have to be paper filed. You do not need to send supporting documentation. Do not send supporting documentation. The more you send the IRS that you don't need to, the worse things are going to be for you. They're not going to be bad. They're not going to come they're not like the mob. They're not going to come and break your kneecaps or anything, but it just, don't confuse them. Give them all they want. It's like Joe Friday, just the facts, ma'am. For the folks who are way old school, and there's still a few of you out there, if you filed your return by hand, you're going to need to fill out Form 8839, a 1040X, and probably a Schedule 8812 for any years you're amending. For families that don't file taxes, if you're a family that doesn't need to file taxes because you're like on a fixed income, you're on Social Security, you don't hit the threshold where you have to file taxes, you shouldn't file taxes until we can make it refundable. Because if you don't need to file taxes, you don't have any income tax that you owe that this credit can help. I don't want families to waste money, time, and effort to get nothing. So if you're ever in a gray area and you're not sure, the first thing you should do is call me, and I'll tell you what I want to see from you in terms of tax information. If you do file taxes, and we'll go from there. For families who adopted in 2017 to 2019, it's, the things are still the same. It's not refundable. Special needs adoptions don't have to document qualified adoption expenses. If a family could get money back, more money back, because they're filing for the adoption tax credit they adopted in 2017 or earlier, and they're going to get money for 2017, they've got to get the 2017 tax return in by April 15th of this year. The IRS they have what they call open and closed years. Anything more than 3 years from the tax filing date, or if you got an extension, the date you actually filed is closed, and you can't get a refund from that year. But so like if I filed my 2017 taxes on February 1st, 2018, I still have till 3 years to the due date, April 15th. I don't have to do it by February 1st. But after April 15th of this year, 2017 is closed to me. I can't get a refund even if I'm due one for that year. So folks in 17, 18, and 19, they can amend their returns. They can still get money for those years and carry forward into any later years where they can also get money. Just remember, if you're amending in those years, that 17 is the old child tax credit interaction, 18, 19, and now 20 are very different from how it was in 17. Don't submit documentation unless required. And you want to do them in tax year order, because you don't know how much carry forward you have for 18 until if you adopted in 17, you need to do 17 first to see how much is left as carry forward on your 18 taxes. Once again, I'm sort of covering all this, but if you get into this situation, it's probably easiest just to call me. For families who adopted before 2017, it's really complicated. Definitely call me first. 2012 to 2016 are closed years. You can't get refunded in those years, but you might be able to carry forward credit into 17 or later, and you may be able to get a refund those years, but it's not always guaranteed. If you use up all the credit before you get to an open year, it's not worth it. Yeah, and anybody that adopted before 2011, please don't have them call me, because they'll be really mad that no one told them about it, and that's not my fault. And I've had those conversations way too much. It's too late for anything in 2011 or earlier. But I'm happy to go over taxes, because if I can get you a couple $100 even, I don't know a family that couldn't use a couple $100. So I'm happy to make sure you don't miss something. But I also don't want you to waste a whole bunch of money or time if you're going to get nothing, right? My goal is to help you maximize your resources without you wasting time or money. So we are going to get done fairly early. Claiming a child as a dependent. Basically, I'm going to go through these 5 tests, and then after that, if people have questions, feel free to ask them. I think you can unmute yourself, I guess is the right word. So claiming a child as a dependent. These tests are in IRS publication 501. So there's the relationship test. To meet this test, the child must be your son, daughter, stepchild, foster child, or descendant, for example, your grandchild of any of them, or your brother, sister, half-brother, half-sister, stepbrother, stepsister, or descendant, for example, your niece or nephew of any of them. Adopted child. An adopted child is always treated as your own child. The term adopted child includes a child who is lawfully placed with you for legal adoption. Foster child is an individual who is placed with you by an authorized placement agency or by judgment, decree, or other order of any court of competent jurisdiction. I don't know if you've ever run into problems there. There are states where families have a hard time getting information from the state or the county, especially usually the social security numbers. And it's like they say foster child in federal, publication, they're eligible. Give them the social security number, but there's always the privacy concern with that. Really annoyingly, in Indiana, they have to ask the birth parent. If the birth parent says no, then they can request it of the judge. Seems like a lot of hurdles to jump through, but at least families do have a route in Indiana to get it. But I've never heard one way or another, good or bad, in Maryland on access to social security numbers for foster parents. So that's a relationship test. Age test. To meet this test, the child must be under the age 19 at the end of the year and younger than you or your spouse if filing jointly. A student under the age of 24 at the end of the year and younger than you or your spouse if filing jointly or permanently and totally disabled at any time during the year, regardless of age. So that's the age test. That one shouldn't be too hard to meet. The big one is the residency test. So to meet this test, the child has to have lived with you for more than half the year, and there are some exceptions for temporary absence to children who were born or died during the year, kidnapped children, and children of divorced or separated parents. So more than half the year. In a non-leap year, like 2021, that's going to be 183 days, because there's 365 days. Half of that, 182.5, so 183. In 2020, it's 184 days, because half is 183 and it's more than half. So 184 days. Some people always use the 6 months. I'm a math nerd geek. I'm going with it 184 in a leap year, 183 in a non-leap year. I think if the child's placed with you on a day and that day, makes it 183, makes it right at, I'm sure they don't count the hours. I can double check if you were ever really concerned about that, but I don't think that would be an issue. I think the IRS just would count that as a day because you had the child for at least part of that day. More importantly, this clarification's come up in the last decade. I think it's always been the case, but it's good that they're more explicit. Death, hopefully not, or birth of a child who is born or died during the year is treated as having lived with you for more than half the year if your home was the child's home more than half the time he or she was alive during the year. The same is true if the child lived with you for more than half the year, except for any required hospital stay following birth. So I give the example, child's born November 1st, November's got 30 days, December's got 31 days, that's 61 days. You have to have the child 31 days. You don't have to have the child 6 months, just more than half of the year that they've been alive. So, support test. Now, back when I first started helping with this changed in a very positive way for foster and adoptive parents. And all families, but particularly foster and adoptive parents and subsidized guardianship, kinship parents. To meet this test, the child can't provide more than half of his or her own support for the year. In the old days, back 05 or 04 is when it changed, the test was you had to provide more than half the support to the child. So imagine you have one of those medically fragile child, you're getting $2,000 a month. In the old days, you'd have to be showing that you spent 2001 of your own dollars each month for that child to meet the support test. These days, you don't, because they don't explicitly say it for adoption subsidy, but they do for foster care payments. Foster care payments and expenses, payments you receive for the support of a foster child from a child placement agency are considered support provided by the agency. Similarly, payments you receive for the support of a foster child from a state or county are considered support provided by the state or county. So foster care payments are not provided by the child. And I have seen one thing to the group in New York that's like Maryland Resource Parent Association, where at least one person from the IRS wrote and treated adoption subsidy the same way. It's something that we're not lawyers, but we would go to bat if as much as we could for you and try and establish some sort of precedence if they were to try and count adoption subsidy as support. What I've seen more often than not is they try and use a qualifying relative classification for children, which does have the old support test. You have to provide more than half the support. And I don't know why two or three cases in 15 years, I don't know why they selected and tried to push those kids as qualifying relative, not qualifying child, but that was really clearly what they were doing. So I've not really seen this come up as an issue, but also people may have issues and not know of our organization. Joint return test. Child can't be married and file a joint return. If you got a foster child, I hope they're not married, and you could have a young adult who's over 18 that's still a student that could be married. But if they're not married, they're not filing a joint return test, you're not going to have a problem with that one. So, the last thing I'll do here, the second, I sort of covered this here, but adoption subsidy, it's actually your state. Back in 1974, question came up and the IRS made a revenue ruling which has the effect of law. Adoption subsidy payments are not considered taxable income for the IRS. Other groups can consider it as income for their programs, as we covered a month ago, but for the IRS, the adoption subsidy is not reportable income. Same with foster care payments. The only time foster care payments would be is if you looked like a group home. I mean, you've got to have 5 or 10 kids and they all have to be getting the specialized rates, intermediate or higher. They're not something you put on. And if you talk to a tax preparer and they say, oh, if you're going to claim the kid as a dependent, you got to, report that as income. That's not true. It's not true at all. And if for some reason you couldn't claim that kid as a dependent, you can still take the adoption tax credit. That part also That was a confusion that happened before. Oh, the one last thing, because there are awesome families out there that adopt sibling groups that are bigger than 3. If you adopt a sibling group bigger than 3, all right, I got to find this. Which one am I? There we go. I don't know if I overrode the sharing or if you've got 2 screens now. Do you see the instructions up there, Arnie? Or form?
Yes, the form's up.
All right, great. So on this form, you'll see there's spots for child 1, 2, and 3. If you adopt a sibling group of 4, you add a second form. You're not limited to 3. I know a family, I know a couple of families that adopted sibling groups of 7. And in those days, it only had a spot for child 1 and 2. They actually filled out 4 forms for this. What happens is down here, they fill out line 12 and on only on the 1 form. But if you adopt a sibling group of 4 or more, you do not you don't get stuck at 3. So this is the form right here is where you mark a child's special needs. This is where it asks for qualified adoption expenses. It says see instructions. Here's the income test. This is the total credit after the income test per child. This adds them up for all the children. This is the carry forward amount. You'll notice this is separate from the income test part, which is 7 through 10 or 7 through 11. So it doesn't apply, the income test doesn't apply to what's carried forward. And then this is where you figure out how much credit you're using for the year. Folks that do have an employer assistance program, I didn't really cover this, usually don't, but if you have your workplace has an employer benefit program, you can also get an exclusion. I rarely deal with this. You don't have to actually get the benefits if it's special needs, but for families who aren't adopting special needs, you would need to have benefits to get that exclusion. And what the exclusion does is it basically doesn't count the adoption benefit as income. It's excluding that. Let's see. I'll show you the scary publication 972. And basically when I'm done with this little show and tell of forms and all that, I'll open up for questions. So get ready to unmute yourself. But so here's the child tax credit worksheet, part 1 and page 1 and page 2. And then there's a line 14 worksheet that you need to do to finish page 2. And there's 2 pages of that. And that needs to look at the earned income worksheet. Software takes care of it. The first time I tried doing it by hand, I really wanted to pull my hair out. Let's see, anything else? So this is, I have not really looked at they've updated the forms this year. Yeah, so basically line 16 for 2020, that's what you owe in income tax. That's your tax liability. That was the 3,000 in my examples. And then you start having credits reduce that down, and then you add in other taxes here, and then you get to total tax. So that's just sort of a quick run through for that. And you'll see in the instructions here, this is the example 1 that I was citing on page 4. And then down here, the line 5 special needs adoption part that we just covered. So if if you have a tax preparer and they're like, oh, no, that's not true. It's like, here it is. And even if you didn't have any qualified adoption expenses for this child, same with, even if the adoptive parents paid no qualifying adoption expenses in example 1. So that is, now are my slides still up, Arnie?
No, the IRS forms is what's up right now.
All right. Then I'll go back to the other and questions. Can you see my slides, Arnie?
No, I'm seeing a blank screen right now.
Okay.
It'll come back, I think.
There we go.
There it comes.
So any questions people have? Or if I now put you out of sleep and you're all just scared and you're like, I want to hire someone that knows this. And that's the other thing I would say for, since you're all in Maryland, I don't know who knows this in Maryland. If you have someone that's really good and understands this and gets that special needs, what special needs is, and they don't need expenses, share that with your fellow resource parents. Because I get that question all the time. I'm like, I tell people to, I think Rebecca, oh, nope, I guess not. I had a little thing up and I don't. So anybody that wants to ask questions, you can unmute yourself, I think.
Yeah, I have a question.
All right.
You were talking about making it refundable.
Mm-hmm.
Would that mean that regardless of how much you owe, you're going to get the full amount back that first year?
Yep. So let me go up on slides.
Because our adoption won't be finalized till this year, which means we'll be filing the taxes over a year from now.
Right.
So if for some reason they make it refundable this year, then we're in good shape. That'd be great for us next year.
Yes. So great question. So I'm going to give you this example at the end. So let's say, let's say I adopted a kid in 2020. I used up 2,400 adoption tax credit. I didn't adopt the kid in 2021, and I have 11,900 available and carry forward for 2021 taxes that I'll file a year from now. Most likely, and this is what the lawyer at the IRS has told me, if Congress says nothing about what happens with the carry forward, which is they never have in any of the bills to make it refundable again, the IRS would review the administrative decision they made in 2010, which was the right one. It helped lots of families. They made the decision that they felt was the right one, that it's the carry forward is also refundable. So what would happen, I was getting $1,000 before this. What would happen is I would get my normal 1,000, considering everything else is the same, plus 11,900 an adoption credit. Well, actually, I'd get another 2,000 because I'd have that child tax credit now too. So my refund would be 14,900. And then after that, it would just be my normal taxes. With the adoption tax credit would be over. But for you, if you adopted in 2021 and this was your situation, you'd get the 14,440 plus the normal 1,000 in our example we had, plus the 2,000 in child tax credit. So that would be 17,440 is what you'd be looking at. Does that help clarify? I hope I ran through that really fast because I've been doing this for 17 years.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Okay.
Josh, there's a question in the chat that says, so the payments received from an agency don't count when considering whether a foster child is a dependent.
They don't count against for the support test. So prior to 2005, the payment actually hurt the ability of resource parents to claim kids as dependents. Remember my example, I said, if I got a medically fragile child, I'm getting $2,000 a month. The only way I would meet the support test under the old rules is if I was spending $2,001 of my own dollars. I spent more than half of it. Because foster care payments are not considered payments or support provided by the child. The child can't provide more than half of his or her own support for the year. Those foster care payments do not hurt the ability to claim that child as a dependent. I sound like a politician or a lawyer, I get it, but I wanted to rephrase it from the other thing. It's not a barrier. It doesn't make it extra easy, it just doesn't make it a problem anymore. I hope that helped.
Okay, we have a question. I adopted a son in May 2019, and I am just learning about this tax credit. I will need to amend my 2019 taxes, correct?
Yep.
We adopted in November 2020, and so we will need to just file a 8839 for this year's taxes, and they're just asking, is that correct?
So the first thing I would do before you file this year's taxes is I would amend last year's taxes. The IRS doesn't have to process it, but you need to know if you have any credit carry forward from last year. You want to know that before you file this year's taxes. Otherwise, you'll have to amend this year's taxes also. So I don't know if you filed hiring someone or you use software. I'm happy to go over your taxes with you and tell you what steps you need to take, but you'll probably need to file a 1040X for last year, an 8839, and likely a Schedule 8812. Those are usually just the three things that need to be done. And that 8812 is where that 1400, the 600 stays in the one part, the 1400 is in a different part. Let me go back to share. Are you seeing the form again?
Yes.
Good. So let's see. So like in my example, I'd have 300 here. I'm assuming, I don't know what that is. 3,000 here, 600 here, 2,400, 3,000, and then.
But I think what you said was the most important thing, Josh, is that they should amend their 2019 return first.
Yep.
So that they can establish carryover before they do their 2020. Because if they don't amend it first, they will have to amend 2020 then as well.
Yep.
So that I think pretty much answers that question. And then somebody else just says, to be clear, that means payments received from DSS are not taxable and therefore do not need to be counted as income for IRS reporting purposes.
Correct.
And I think we just need to be clear that the payments from DSS clarify that, because there is just a little bit of a difference there.
Adoption assistance payments are not income provided, are not income for the IRS. Adoption, subsidy, and foster care payments only if you look like a group home. Yeah. And I can get the link for that language with what you send out to people. But the revenue ruling is from 1974, and that has the effect of law. So.
Okay, then we have another one that says, regarding a foster parent claiming a child in care as a dependent, I understand that the foster child payments are not a barrier, but I still don't understand how much the foster parents need to be able to show they spent on the child that year to be able to claim them. Do they have to show anything?
Nope.
Or it goes by the amount of time? Half of the time that child is alive in the calendar year.
You need to meet that criteria also, but there's not an accounting. The only way there would be any sort of accounting is if the child had some sort of refund or resources of their own that might count. I don't think Social Security would be. I think trust fund would be the most likely, but I doubt, child welfare has, a child that's got a trust. But they could. I mean, it does happen.
Okay.
With a lot of my kids.
About survivor benefits.
That I'm not sure of. That is a good question. I will have to get back on that one. Okay,
we'll come back with an answer. Lauren, I'm not sure I understand your question. $1 if the child earns 0. What are you saying there? Can you help clarify for me? Okay, I'm not.
So
okay.
To meet this test, the child can't have provided more than half of his or her own support for the year. So another way we could look at this is if you're getting a foster care or adoption assistance payment of $500 a month, okay, let's just say 500, nice round number. The child would actually have to provide more than 500 because the state is providing 500. So to disqualify this child, to meet this test, the child can't have provide more than half of his or her own support for the year. So actually the foster care payments do make it easier to meet this test because that is support that the child is not providing. I'm not a lawyer or tax expert, but that seems to make a lot of sense to me. I have looked at this a lot over the years, but that does seem to make sense to me.
I have a comment about claiming foster children as dependents. We did it last year. The two foster children, they had been with us for 7 months, so we met that. So we claimed them and we did an e-file, and very quickly we got a bounce back saying
they had already been
someone
claimed.
on our, it didn't say who, but it just said someone on our return had been claimed by someone else.
Yeah.
Now, I guess, I can't remember if it said on the letter we got or we just looked it up, but we had the choice of either changing our return and e-filing, or we could leave it as is and mail it in and face a audit, which we did. And ultimately we won. We got a letter. We got a letter from DSS, sent it in.
Yep.
And, it took, 3 or 4 months longer than it should have, but ultimately
it'll be over soon and I'll come and check on it.
We made it through it. But yeah, so there may be more steps if you do choose to do that.
The thing I will couple, it does happen all over this country. Couple things. If it's happened to you and you're doing this, I would file as quickly as possible. You still may not be the first one in, but you did the right thing in terms of, and this is what everybody needs to know, is get something from the agency saying that this child was legally placed with you for that more than half the year. Cause that is like, if you ever play a game that's a card game that's got Trump, that's the Trump card. Only one person or one couple can meet that more than half the year. There's not 2 different tax filing households that can meet that. So get that letter from your agency saying that you had that child for more than half the year, and submit that with it, a copy of that. But try and file as quickly as possible. And then also, I assume once you adopt that you're going to try and get that social security number changed, which I don't know the rules these days. In the past, it was harder, but the guidance has gone away and I've never seen new guidance on it. I think it's gotten better as identity theft has become a bigger issue. You're still on mute, Arnie, if you're trying to talk to us.
Sorry, I had to mute. My daughter needed convinced to go to bed. But anyhow, are there any other questions? Because we have time, we'll want to make sure that we do whatever necessary. Josh is also providing a website and an email address and a phone number. And so we'll certainly want to help with any questions or situations that exist. And since this is a federal tax credit, we want families to get as much benefit and use these dollars because it is important to support the children. And believe me, there's a lot of needs. As an adoptive dad of 4, there's always something to spend money on. And they need it. And if you can get this benefit that is written into the tax code, we want you to receive it for sure.
Yeah.
So are there any other questions?
I get sometimes people like, well, I already get the adoption subsidy. I feel guilty. It's like, it's the law. And, folks on like Wall Street or something, they'll take advantage of every tax break they can get. So why shouldn't families who are caring for children from the child welfare system? We have a little more personal stake. My father was actually, used to be our executive director. He's retired 5 years now, almost 6 years, but he was actually one of the ones leading for it to be not tied to expenses. Because it wasn't helping families adopting from foster care, because you typically didn't have expenses, and we knew that, and we helped get that changed. That's why we've been there. Plus, I do the adoption subsidy stuff, so that's why we've always been sort of the go-to organization in the adoption world for information on this tax credit.
Well, we will put up the slides in the next couple of days. They'll be available on our website, mrpa.org or mdkids1.org. And you'll scroll down through the page and you will find them towards the bottom. So, okay, we have another question. We had a foster child with us since birth, July 2019. But didn't claim her on our 2019 taxes. Should I file an amended return for last year?
You sure can. You might run into the same problem that Matthew ran into, where if it were me, I filed that amended return because you didn't know, I would get the placement dates documentation from the agency before doing that. I mean, that's one thing where I would attach something from the get-go, because if someone's already claimed that child, which actually might not happen if it's a newborn, the birth family might not have known the social if you got them from birth. But if not, at least get a copy of that letter in case the IRS questions it. One question I have for that, because rules changed in recent years. This is the hard part, not being a tax professional, because not all the rules are right fresh in my mind all the time, like a tax professional would be. But if that child didn't get a Social Security number until after April 15th of 2020, it's not worth doing, because child has to have a social by the time that tax return is filed. So if the child did not have one, and you can contact with me and I can get that exact language down. But that's one thing that's changed in the last few years, is the timing on having a Social Security number for claiming the child tax credit. Because that's all that's available now. Prior to 2018 and 2017 and earlier, there was a $4,000 per child exemption, both for kids, for adults too, but also kids over 17, as well as kids under 16 who also had the $1,000 child tax credit, but that exemption went away. And that's why there's that $500 child tax credit above for kids 17 and older. It all makes sense if you've looked at all the math and all the interlocking numbers, but you can always just reach out to me and we can go over it specifically with you.
Somebody just said, thanks, Josh. The IRS is hiring.
I don't know that they would take me, and I probably have more. The other thing I will say, because I do know the lawyer that writes the instructions, if you had something really tricky, I can get an answer faster than you, and more authoritatively on this tax credit than you could by being on hold for 2 hours and having someone who may or may not really know. So if you have something really tricky or whatever, I would definitely recommend contacting us. I haven't said that enough to contact me.
Okay, please check our website. We will also be announcing on social media what our next first Tuesday will be. I believe it is February the 2nd. So we will have another go around on Groundhog's Day. and
around and around and around.
Yes.
No, just kidding.
So we will figure out what that subject is. There were some comments in the chat. I thank you very much. We will look at that, and we will continue to bring things back on the first Tuesday of each month at 8 o'clock. It's a fascinating discussion. I love the opportunity to dialogue with you. Just so you know, there were 33 people on the
nice.
call tonight. So I'm thankful for each of you. I hope that it was helpful. And I hope that you get a few extra dollars to help you as you meet the needs of the kids in your care, because it's an incredible opportunity to serve the kids in Maryland. So, and thank you, Josh. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being my friend. And thanks for all that you do for the foster and adoptive families all across the country. So
thank you.
Thank you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.